Hi guys, welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive, kind of counterintuitive paradox. It's something you might have wondered about before. Why is it that when people are put under intense pressure, especially, financial or time pressure, they sometimes make choices that seem to actively make their situations much, much worse?
So, really, why do people with fewer resources sometimes make counterproductive decisions? Well, right off the bat, let's bust a very common, very harmful myth. People with less money or less time do not make worse decisions because of some inherent character flaw or like a lack of willpower. Absolutely not. As we're going to see today, the research actually points to a completely different and deeply fascinating biological and psychological culprit.
It all boils down to a concept called the scarcity mindset. Researchers Sendhil, Mullainathan, and Eldar, Shafir define this as the mental state that kicks in when people feel they just don't have enough resources to cover their needs. Now, that could be a lack of money, a lack of time, or even a lack of food. What's absolutely crucial to understand here is that the experience of scarcity itself actively consumes significant mental energy. It fundamentally alters our cognition. So, poverty doesn't just restrict your wallet, right? It literally restricts your mind.
And that brings us to a foundational concept, the bandwidth tax. Think of your brain like a computer. Actually, scratch that. Think of it more like your smartphone. You only have so much processing power, or bandwidth, to use at any given time. This bandwidth includes things like your working memory and your executive control. When you're constantly managing limited time or juggling a super tight budget, that constant background hum of worry acts like a heavy, draining app running in the background of your phone. It taxes your basic cognitive resources, leaving you with way less processing power for literally everything else in your life.
To see just how heavily this taxes the brain, get this staggering number, 13 to 14. In this really fascinating study done in a New Jersey shopping center, researchers just prompted shoppers to think about a large financial problem, something like a major car repair. Well, for low-income individuals, that simple prompt caused an immediate drop in their performance on standard cognitive logic tests, a drop of 13 to 14 IQ points, just from thinking about the problem.
To put that severity into perspective, losing 13 to 14 IQ points, that is roughly equivalent to the cognitive impairment you suffer after losing an entire night of sleep. Imagine trying to make complex, long-term life decisions while you are functioning on literally zero sleep, day after day after day. That is the daily bandwidth tax of poverty. It vividly illustrates that this is a systemic, environmental burden on human cognition, definitely not an individual failing.
Okay, but here is a really surprising twist from researcher Sendhil Mullainathan. He says, when scarcity captures the mind, we become more attentive and efficient. Now, wait a minute, didn't we just say scarcity lowers your IQ? Well, yeah, it does. But it also creates what researchers call a focus dividend. Basically, in the short term, scarcity forces us to intensely lock in on the immediate task at hand.
This focus dividend is brilliantly illustrated in a research paper called Scarcity Frames Value. The authors found that because people experiencing scarcity are just so hyper-aware of their limited resources, they naturally engage in trade-off thinking. They intrinsically recognize that buying one thing means explicitly giving up another. This focus dividend actually causes them to ignore irrelevant contextual marketing tricks and engage in highly consistent economic valuation. So in some ways, under scarcity, we actually act closer to the perfectly rational models of classical economics.
We can see exactly how this plays out in the real world with the classic beer on the beach study. Participants were asked how much they'd be willing to pay for a beer if it came from a fancy resort versus, say, a rundown grocery store. High-income individuals offered significantly more money just because the beer came from a fancy resort. But lower-income participants, they offered a consistent price regardless of where it came from. Why? Because a dollar is a dollar. They weigh the actual opportunity cost of that money, what else that specific dollar could buy, not the fancy context of the resort.
And we see this exact same consistency in the famous tablet discount study. Imagine you can save $50 on a new tablet if you drive across town. If the tablet is $300, high-income people will usually make the drive. But if the tablet is $1,000, high-income people suddenly won't drive for that exact same $50 because it feels like a smaller percentage of the total price. Lower-income individuals, however, remain consistently willing to travel for the $50 discount no matter what the total price of the tablet is. Because again, $50 is $50. It buys the same amount of groceries either way. Their valuation remains totally stable.
We can ground this sharp, efficient focus with what the sources call the angry blueberries effect. It's kind of funny. In a game where players shot blueberries at waffles, players who were given an absolute abundance of blueberries just fired wildly and carelessly.
But players given only a few blueberries who were experiencing artificial scarcity aimed far more carefully and efficiently. They invested way more effort into each shot. Scarcity essentially made them better marksmen.
All right, but here is the massive catch. Let's look at the dark side of this intense focus, tunneling and the trap. That careful aiming we just talked about, it comes at a severe cognitive cost. When you're hyper-focused on an immediate crisis, like, say, figuring out how to make rent tomorrow, your mind creates a tunnel. You see the immediate problem brilliantly, for sure, but you experience attentional neglect. You become completely blind to almost everything outside of that tunnel.
Because of this attentional narrowing, individuals hyperfixate on immediate prices. If your budget is tiny, you might spend all your time in the grocery store just staring at price tags. But because your mental bandwidth is totally consumed by doing the math, you might completely neglect the nutritional value or the calories of the food you're buying. You're solving the immediate problem of cost, right? But missing the long-term consequences to your health.
And this leads directly to a really chaotic cycle of juggling. People under scarcity constantly patch crises as they arise, endlessly shifting their limited resources around. For example, a busy single mom, totally drained by managing daily survival, might literally lack the working memory to remember to fill out a discounted lunch form for her child, which ends up costing her more in the long run. Or folks might resort to payday loans. Furthermore, as Psychology Today points out, people might even engage in compulsive spending just to get a brief dopamine release, a temporary chemical relief from the crushing chronic stress of tunneling.
So, the absolutely crucial point is, what do we do about this? We need to shift our focus to designing better systems. If counterproductive decisions are a product of a taxed environment rather than a flawed character, how can governments, workplaces, and institutions design programs that don't accidentally add to this bandwidth tax?
Well, we can look to places like the New South Wales government in Australia for some really solid, evidence-based answers. In their Behavioral Insights and Action Guide, they explicitly acknowledge that their own government services, things like complex forms, confusing policies, bureaucratic hurdles, can inadvertently act as a cognitive tax on the already limited bandwidth of the exact people who need the help the most.
By making these interactions seamless, governments can actually prevent themselves from exacerbating the tunneling effect. For example, simply simplifying the language of domestic violence orders into plain English, or using bold colors to highlight a Pay Now stamp on a speeding fine, or even just sending timely text message reminders for hospital appointments. Small things like this can dramatically improve engagement and compliance.
Let's rapidly summarize these powerful strategies. We can combat scarcity through the simplification of paperwork, using timely reminders, presenting salient and clear information, and implementing default choices, like auto-enrolling people in retirement savings. But honestly, most importantly, we must help people build slack. That's a buffer of spare time or spare money. Without slack, a single unexpected shock, like a medical bill or a broken-down car, throws you right back into the overwhelming cycle of the scarcity trap.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway of this explainer: empathy over blame. When we see someone struggling, missing deadlines, or making seemingly poor financial choices, our default reaction as a society is so often just judgment. But we now know that bad decisions made under intense constraints are largely a product of a severely taxed cognitive bandwidth. This science gives us a rigorous factual reason to replace blame with profound empathy.
So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to chew on. How can we design our own lives, and our society as a whole, to build enough slack so that a single crisis doesn't completely consume all our bandwidth? Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.